My name is Andrew Laurence, and on behalf of the Ethiopian American Cultural Center, I have been asked by the District of Columbia Office of African Affairs, in celebration of the annual Congressional Black Caucus meeting and the Ron H. Brown African American series, to give this presentation today. I have made a PowerPoint presentation, the subject of which is Ethiopian and African American Unity and Friendship. I thought it was appropriate because many in the Ethiopian and African American community are not very aware of the long historical friendship between the two communities. We start off in the Bible. There, African Americans have always noticed Ethiopia as appearing in the Bible numerous times, especially in Psalm 68:31, where it says, "Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God." These references in the Bible were very important to African Americans in that they recognized themselves in the Bible and all that it stood for. In 1808, Ethiopian merchants and African Americans established the Abyssinian Baptist Church. This was the first non-segregated Baptist church in Harlem, New York. They named the church after Abyssinia, which was historically called Ethiopia and mentioned in the Bible in various places. 1800s had many great writers such as Phyllis Wheatley, Frederick Douglass, Reverend Richard Allen, and Freemason Prince Hall. These were abolitionists, Africanists, Freemasons, and they referenced Ethiopia regularly to inspire respect for their African ancestry and raise the dignity of blacks in America, as did other abolitionists such as Martin Delany, Robert Alexander Young, Nat Turner, and David Walker. After the Battle of Adwa in 1896, where the Ethiopians were able to defend their independence over the Italians, African Americans increasingly looked toward Ethiopia as a bastion of black dignity in a continent colonized by European powers. Paul Laurence Dunbar, he wrote the famous poem Ode to Ethiopia, 1896. This poem symbolizes Ethiopia's triumph over Italy in the Battle of Adwa, encouraging pride and hope in the African American people. Writers such as Sterling Brown, County Cullen, Zora Neale Hurston continued in this tradition of great African American literature on Ethiopia. William E.B. Du Bois, he influenced many African diaspora activists with his writings and activism and scholarly articles in the Crisis magazine. He was known as the father of Pan-Africanism and encouraged many other activists such as Sylvester Williams, George Padmore, C.L.R. James, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Edward Blyden, Walter Rodney, Paul Robeson, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, to name a few. Meta Warwick Fuller, the first African-American artist to make art celebrating Afrocentric and Ethiopianist themes. This was repeated by other visual artists such as painter Aaron Douglas, sculptor Augustus Savage, and photographer James Van Der Zee. The first Ethiopian delegation officially to the U.S. was called the Abyssinian Mission. It included Dejazmach Nadu, Blatingada Hiroi Wolde Selassie, Kantiba Gebru Desta, and Atto Sinkas. This was the first official delegation of Ethiopians to the United States, and they visited a number of cities and black churches and organizations in America. The Commandment Keepers. This is a sect of black Jews founded in 1919. They claim Ethiopian descent as their ancestors and believe the biblical patriarchs to have been black. They numbered in the hundreds of thousands in numerous U.S. cities at their height. Madam C.J. Walker, the self-made American female entrepreneur and civil rights activist. She inspired and followed in the tradition of Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, and Rosa Parks. Her daughter, Alila Walker, patron of the Harlem Renaissance, visited Empress Zauditu in Ethiopia as early as 1922. Drusilla Dungy Houston. She is credited with creating a Pan-African framework proclaiming the African origin of civilization. She's followed by other historians like Joseph Ben-Jacquinin, Sheikh Anta Diop, Ivan van Sertima, and John Henry Clark, to name just a few. Marcus Mosiah Garvey, publisher, entrepreneur, orator, and founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He encouraged pride in being black and worked to reverse the mindset of inferiority that centuries of enslavement had ingrained on the minds of black Americans. This activist, Jamaican-born, prophesied the coronation of Emperor Haile Selassie in 1927, saying, "Look to Africa, for there a king shall be crowned." Mignon Ford, wife of Harlem's Jewish leader Dr. Arnold Josiah Ford, traveled to Ethiopia in 1930 and founded the first secondary school for girls in Ethiopia. Here you see her son Abi, a Howard professor, Yosef, former director of Ethiopian Community Center in Washington, D.C., and two of her adopted daughters. Hubert F. Julian, nicknamed the Black Eagle, African American aviation pioneer. He traveled to Ethiopia to help Ethiopia against the attack by Mussolini and his fascist invasion, and when he came to Ethiopia he was well received by Emperor Haile Selassie in 1931. Dr. Elaine Locke, educated at Harvard University and the first African American Rhodes Scholar. He chaired the philosophy department at Howard, and his theories of black art encouraged black artists to recognize and incorporate their African heritage within their work. Lois Mailou Jones, painter and teacher, she founded the art department at Howard University. Her work suggests a hopeful future made possible by other Harlem Renaissance artists like Romain Verdin, Jacob Lawrence, William Johnson, and Aaron Douglas, as early as 1932. Langston Hughes, poet laureate of Harlem. He is famous for his depiction of everyday life of African Americans and identifies with the struggle of Ethiopia and the uplift of all black peoples. Dr. Malako Bayen graduated from Howard University in 1936 as the first Ethiopian medical doctor in the United States. He co-founded the Ethiopian Research Council and merged many supportive pro-Ethiopian aid groups into the Ethiopian World Federation while publishing and recruiting African American experts to help develop Ethiopia. The Ethiopian World Federation is in many cities throughout the United States, and to this day has been a big force in organizing conferences and programs dealing with Ethiopia itself and with the heritage and integrity that Ethiopia represents throughout the world. Professor Leo Hansberry, he started the African Civilization section of Howard University in the History Department way back in 1922. And then in 1934 he helped organize with Dr. Malako Bayen the Ethiopian Research Council. This beginning of African studies guided the efforts of others such as Molefi Keta Asante, Mulana Karenga, Joseph Harris, and Amiri Baraka, among others. Here's a reception of the Ethiopian Research Council at Howard University in 1936. You'll notice Dr. William Leo Hansberry and, of course, Ambassador Dr. Ralph Bunch in the pictures. The second invasion of Ethiopia by Mussolini's fascist Italy in 1939 was very galvanizing to all Africans in the diaspora. In fact, tensions grew so bad in the U.S. between Italian Americans and African Americans that race riots were reported in major cities. Here you see Joe Louis knocking out Italian Primo Canara in Yankee Stadium in New York City. This was very symbolic of the feelings at the time, and many people were in attendance and found this to be a very historic fight especially in relation to the Italian-Ethiopian War. Here you see a volunteer center in Harlem where African Americans volunteered to fight for Ethiopia against Mussolini's Italian invasion in 1936. Joel A. Rogers, he became the first black war correspondent when he reported for the Pittsburgh Courier on Mussolini's campaign. He also was there for Emperor Selassie's coronation. After returning to the U.S., he published a highly popular illustrated pamphlet entitled The Real Facts About Ethiopia. I regard this PowerPoint in the same vein as Joel A. Rogers. Colonel John Robinson, African American pilot and Ethiopian war hero. As a Tuskegee graduate, he literally started his own airline and pilot school. Here you see him arriving home in Chicago after heroically leading the Ethiopian Air Force in battle against Mussolini's Italian forces. Here you see on his return from Ethiopia 20,000 people in Chicago when he made his first public speech after arriving from Ethiopia in 1936. Colonel Robinson literally memorized every mountain from Addis to Adwa in order to escape into the clouds when Italian fighter pilots chased him, but would not follow him for risk of crashing into those mountains. After the war, he returned to Ethiopia and trained many of their future pilots, and lived the rest of his life in Ethiopia, where he was buried in 1954. Here are some of the African American pilots that trained the first Ethiopian Air Corps that actually led to the start of Ethiopian Airlines. The Rastafari movement. This focused on Afrocentrism and black pride. Rastafari was the name of Haile Selassie before he became emperor. They believed that Africa, and particularly Ethiopia, are where Zion or paradise shall be created. As such, Rastafari orientates itself around African culture, Bob Marley being one of its musical spokespeople. Ato Yilma Deresa, Ethiopia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, recognizing the appeal of Ethiopia had as an ideal to the African American community, came and successfully recruited African American teachers, technicians, and other professionals to come to Ethiopia and assist in its post-war reconstruction. Here are some of those professionals in Addis Ababa in 1945. They were teachers, educators, administrators, reverends, and other various professions. Emperor Haile Selassie granted 500 acres of land in Shashamane, Ethiopia, and it was to the black peoples of the world to whom belonged this divine heritage, and today hundreds of African Americans and African Caribbean people make Shashamane their home. Here's a photo of President Mordecai Johnson of Howard University escorting His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie to a special convocation during which the Emperor receives the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws at Howard University in 1954. Here's a newspaper article from the Ethiopian Herald, 1954. This was when Haile Selassie came to America and was greeted by huge crowds in Harlem. While in Harlem, he visited that Abyssinian Baptist church we discussed earlier, and there he presented to the pastor and U.S. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., an Ethiopian Orthodox cross. Emperor Haile Selassie traveled throughout the United States, where he met various peoples and churches and made attendance at many organizations, meetings to spread goodwill. Here you see him autographing, giving an autograph to an African American Korean War veteran who fought alongside Ethiopian soldiers during the United Nations forces in the Korean War. Here you see Ethiopian students heading to America in 1957. They studied various subjects they can use to return and develop their country. Howard University would actually graduate more Ethiopians to this day than any other university in the United States. Here are 12 of the 33 founding members of the Organization of African Unity. And for those who may not recognize the faces, their names are printed below. Ethiopia would be the home of the Organization of African Unity, which now is called the African Union. Again, here you see the Emperor visiting Parkside Baptist Church on one of his several trips to share the goodwill of Ethiopia towards America. This was in 1964, Los Angeles, California. Ethiopian police and military bands in the 1960s were influenced heavily by American jazz sounds. They formed many musical groups in the capital, incorporating the soul, swing, and cha-cha groups that were popular at the time. Here we have Ethiopia's version of the popular African American singing group, The Temptations. A couple of famous people in this picture are Tilahun Gesese and Mahmoud Ahmed on the left. Duke Ellington visited Ethiopia 1973. Here you see the program of his command performance at the Haile Selassie I Theater in Addis Ababa. Here, Duke Ellington performs with the Ethiopian jazz band headed by Melatu Astake. And here you see Duke Ellington receiving Ethiopia's highest Medal of Honor from Emperor Haile Selassie. Dick Gregory, comedian and activist, actually developed a nutritional formula that would reduce the cost of rehabilitating a starving child in Ethiopia from $4 to 45 cents. It was so effective, the Ethiopian government made the formula available in all of its rehabilitation centers. Here you have We Are the World, the song written in '85 by Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie, produced and conducted by Quincy Jones, and recorded by various popular musicians. The charity single conceived by Harry Belafonte raised funds to help famine relief efforts in Ethiopia in the '84-'85 drought. Congressman Mickey Leland, whose plane crashed in 1989 while delivering food aid, is recognized publicly in Ethiopia. You have Mickey Leland College, Mickey Leland Street, and there are other supportive African Americans that have recognitions throughout Ethiopia. Alexander Bogassian, Ethiopian painter and professor of art at Howard University, very influential by incorporating African American literature, history, and music in his art. He created a link between African and African Americans, especially in the turbulent Black Power movement days. Now we have African Americans such as Julius Coles, Randall Robinson, Andrew Young, Melvin Foote, and many, many others who have continued in the tradition of outspoken leadership on issues concerning Ethiopia, Africa, and African Americans. Haile Gerima, very popular professor of film at Howard University. He's known perhaps best for his film Sankofa in 1993 and his 1999 film Adwa, An African Victory, where he links contemporary Africans in Africa and the diaspora with the early founders of the Pan-African movement. Here you have various African American congresspersons participating with many Ethiopian Americans and creating constituency groups to advocate and influence local and national political representatives. They collaborate with each other on key issues relating to education, trade, and AIDS in Ethiopia. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, the first professor of African American Studies at Harvard University. He founded the Ethiopian Students Association of North America at Howard University and continues to bring together the African diaspora through dialogue and collaboration. Many commemorative celebrations were held throughout the United States on the centennial anniversary in 2004 of the formal signing of relations between Ethiopia and the U.S. Programs and panel discussions were held in various universities to identify areas of mutual cooperation and unity between Ethiopians and African Americans, furthering the uplift of all Africans everywhere. The Ethiopian American Constituency Foundation, at their annual celebration of Black History Month, continues to provide opportunities to find ways for Ethiopian and African American community members to work together on local and global issues of the day in unity and friendship. Ms. Aurelia E. Brazil, the first African American U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia. She notes in Ethiopia that they were proud of the many achievements of the African American community, from those first few like Dr. Arnold Josiah Ford and Colonel John Robinson, who came to Ethiopia in the 1930s, to the Ethiopian Americans of the new millennium, many of whom are now working hard for the good of the country. Here is a photo of Ethiopian and African American business owners discussing how they can enhance community relations at the famous Ben's Chili Bowl in Washington, D.C. Here is Imperial Highness Prince Ermias Haile Selassie, grandson of Emperor Haile Selassie, recognizing African American soldiers who fought on behalf of Ethiopia at the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Again in Washington, here are Ethiopians who are honoring the African American pilots who did defend Ethiopia against Mussolini's Italian invasion. On the 200th anniversary of the Abyssinian Baptist Church's founding, the church members made a pilgrimage to Ethiopia after 200 years, a milestone that represents the continuous role of the African American church as a galvanizing force in the building of beloved communities. Ethiopia then celebrated the 200th anniversary of Abyssinian Church at various activities throughout the year. Here is a program that was held where Ethiopian artist and Howard University graduate Ato Faso Dawit presents a historic painting to Reverend Dr. Calvin Butts, the current pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church, in celebration of that church's 200th anniversary. Queen Bee, Beyoncé, African-American pop singing sensation, visited Ethiopia for the Ethiopian Millennium in 2008, where she performed to a sold-out concert on New Year's Eve. Here are Ethiopian Americans participating in the American political system, and this was a very important organizing committee in Virginia, which was a swing state during the election. And I never get to quote myself, so I thought I would end with the righteousness of the Ethiopian-inspired Pan-African movements for civil and political justice must now be followed by a grassroots Pan-African-led movement for sustainable economic justice through fair trade, fair labor, and environmental standards among all the nations of the world. Here are some general bibliographic sources. Very important: William R. Scott and Ayele Bekeri, who are experts on the field of Ethiopian and African American relations. Many general reference and photographic sources. Here are just a few. And of course, the newspapers, Ethiopian and African American publications, just a few of them that I've gone to find much of this information. I hope this has been enlightening, and I hope that you share this information. And if you contact me at andrew@ethiopianculture.org, I can mail you a paper or a CD copy of this that you can share with others. Thank you very much.